I don't want to, just to say something, I don't want to do my introduction for your work and your work just now. I'm doing that tomorrow for you and Saturday for you. Yes? So I would just like to start with you, if you agree. Would you? No, not really. Not really. Okay. Good. I understand that. But so, Rupert, would you like to start just... Yes. Out of nothing, from scratch, yeah.
Well, is this working? Yes. First, I would say it's a great pleasure to be here with everyone on this stage, because there's a common thread through all our work, which is rare to find, and it's rare to find people who have so much in common together, and with time to talk about it as well. I think I first became aware of the potential of memories from families arising through therapeutic work, through meeting Madame Schützenberger in Paris quite a number of years ago. And she told me some of the things she'd been discovering through her work. And these did indeed seem to me like memories carried in the fields of the group, because my own work is about fields and fields of memory. And I was very struck by these examples, and I wanted to see how this could be understood more systematically. Well, in her new book, The Ancestor Syndrome, here is this development. So this is a very exciting stage of her work. In the case of Bert's work, I first heard of this here in Germany. Many German friends were telling me, you must hear more about the work of Bert Hellinger. I'm sure it would interest you. I heard this so many times that when I learned he was coming to London, Jill, my wife, and I went to his workshop. And I was astonished at what I saw, because I've worked a lot with the idea of morphic fields in animal social groups, in biological development. And there, on the stage before me, I saw these family constellations, and it was perfectly clear these were the fields of families. They were actually ritually enacted before one in a kind of drama or ritual form, with this really impressive healing quality. And my own work is about fields which involve interrelations in space and which involve memories from the past. And there are many field theories which just have interrelations in space without memory. But it was clear that here was a field theory which had a kind of memory in it. The process that gives rise to this memory I call morphic resonance. But for me it was an astonishing thing to see morphic fields actually in action, not as an abstract concept on paper or as something you investigate simply through scientific experiments, but actually acted out in front of one. So this was a tremendous revelation, and I was really excited by this. Bert and I had a chance to meet in London, and subsequently I had a chance to go to a workshop that Hunter did in London, which was a great revelation too. It was a wonderful experience. So I'm very impressed by this work, and I think there's a lot in common between this and the more theoretical and biological work I've been doing on morphic fields. I mean, I have so many questions, I don't know really where to begin, but one question that I think I might start asking Bert isn't a very profound one, but it's one that arises whenever great discoveries are made by therapists, because therapists, almost by definition, are spending their time looking at the abnormal, the extremes. And of course, we learn a lot about the normal from looking at the abnormal. We learn a lot about health through looking at disease. But I wondered how much work or study you've done on happy family fields, if there are any. And, I mean, such people probably wouldn't come and present themselves for therapy, but do you see any way of extending this into a more research way, to look at the dynamics of normal families and family dynamics in general?
May I continue? Well, there is a tendency at present that we extend the field away from psychotherapy and include many other areas, because it seems that in many various applications, the what I call orders of love, which lead to entanglements, and the ways which lead to solution can be applied there. And as examples I give, friends who work in prisons. We were in London last year and worked in 3 prisons. And it was very astonishing how the work was received by the prisoners. And it seems there is now a chance that in Germany, a very renowned society wants to do research on how to apply that work in prisons. And my suggestion was that we work first with murderers and their victims, because that seems to be the extreme case, and it shows the laws best. And as I understand, your work also is, looks first at the very extreme cases. They are the most important ones. I think if we can gather from them ways on solving these difficult issues, then it can be extended more easily to other fields. Another field is schools, for instance. Teachers can do that apply that without being psychotherapists, or in social work can be easily applied. So we try to get away from the restrictions of psychotherapy and apply it in a wider field. And I think that's quite in harmony with what you actually want to achieve.
Do you hear me? Yeah. It's very fascinating for me to be able to try to solve some of the riddles about which I'm breaking my head recently, is how we can have a memory of facts and things and things that we have never seen, that happen 1, 2, 3, 10, 20, 30 generations before we were born, of which we have very clear photographic images in our head and that we are following all the time. One of my problems is to see and meet somebody who does something for the first time in his life. Usually, when you look a little bit back, you find it is just a repetition of the past and a repetition of something that was unhappy, traumatic, or unsolved. I would like to take one very difficult, painful example that is on all TVs and all the papers actually, which is Kosovo. When you look at Kosovo as a repetition, then we go to the real battle of Kosovo, June 28, 1389, more than 600 years ago. A very difficult battle between the Muslims, Ottomans, and the Christians, the Serbs already. And then a Serb killed the Sultan, and then the Sultan killed Prince Lazar. Then the Christians, the Serbs, made of Prince Lazar a saint, Saint Lazar, and the Ottomans became furious with the Serbs. And then sometime later, let's say some 500 and some years later, an Austrian crown prince went to Sarajevo on June 28. Serbs took it as an offense. They assassinate him, and that was the origin of the First World War that I could never understand before I came to the repetition of June 28. And then somebody who has a very good memory, maybe a wicked memory, called Milosevic, brought the remains of Saint Lazare to Kosovo on June 28, the anniversary day, 1989, exactly 600 years later, and would make a monument on which he said, Kosovo, June 1389, June 1989, we are not going to let the Muslims rule the Serbs. And they start killing the Muslims that day. This is the origin of the Kosovo battle now. If we don't look at it as a transgenerational memory, we just cannot stop it. And we cannot understand what's going on. And what did fascinate me in what I have seen a little bit of the work of Hellinger is that how quickly you could put a family, he puts a family in a constellation, and then they feel and remember what happened before, it seems. And I'm working on post-traumatic events of the last wars of 1914 or 1870, or even the French Revolution, or the guillotine, or even the Crusades. And then, when you are working with families who are hurt, who have problems, very often we have to go 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, 900 years back, and then we suddenly feel that was the problem. We solve it then and there. We beg pardon for what happened in the Crusades or during the French Revolution or during the war. And then the people actually are healed of their problems. Will it be terminal cancer? Will it be tuberculosis? Will it be asthma? Will it be many other things? And so I was hoping that by this round table we could try to understand more what one of my teachers, Moreno, called the family and group co-unconscious, which is very close to the morphogenic fields of Sheldrake and of Hellinger's work. And I was hoping this roundtable could help us to understand more of it.
I'm sorry. I can speak English. This might be a time to talk about some of the thoughts you've had about being in the soul rather than having a soul.
Well, when we did the family constellations, we also had the idea of the morphogenetic field, because certain memories are active in later generations. And if there was somebody who had a very difficult life or traumatic life circumstances or traumatic death, then in a later generation there is a repetition of that. In a way, but beneath this, there seem to be certain laws according to which certain events are repeated. And I give an example, just a recent one. There was in a supervision group, a therapist set up the family of a client. The father had killed his wife. 2 daughters were left and are now in the care of the wife's sister. And the 2 children are very upset. And then I set up the man and the woman, that sister, and the 2 children. The wife immediately was frightened, and she ran to her sister for protection. The man turned away. He wanted to leave. He had actually killed himself after he had killed his wife. So I had to make them face the real issue. So I brought the wife and let her lie on the floor in order to show she's not alive. She is now dead. So she can't just go to her sister for protection anymore. So I re-established the reality in this point. Then I brought the man back, let him look at his wife. And he looked at her, he could not move. And then I let him breathe deeply, and suddenly it broke out of him, a very, very deep pain, a tremendous pain. And then he fell down on his knees and looked at his wife, and he just cried. Then, only then, he could really look at her. And then I let him lie at the side of his wife, because it was reality, he was also dead. And then the 2, they moved together with very, very deep love. That's a strange thing, that after that, they just are united in deep love. And from this I conclude, and I had similar experiences in other constellations, even more dramatic, that at the end, if both recognize themselves as dead, then the dead, they move together. And to go back to your example of Kosovo, I could imagine if the Serbs could see their dead soldiers over all those centuries lying side by side with the dead Muslims, and they just look at them. And if you would set that up actually in a family constellation, you would have the strange movement that those dead would just move together, mingle with one another, come to peace with very, very deep love. And then those living could perhaps look at one another in a different way. Now, this movement is for me only possible if the perpetrators, the victims, whoever, are at the service of a force reaching beyond them, far beyond them. And only if all look at this greater force, then the antagonism between those can cease. And they become very humble in the source of this greater force. And what unites all of these, I call them a greater soul. And I don't have a better name for that. But it goes beyond the fields, because the field is fixed, and this great, you also call that soul as far as I remember, the soul is something that steers, that directs a course of history and of personal life. And in this soul we participate. And instead of looking at the individual as having a soul, he participates in a soul. And this soul has several levels. And there in the foreground there is a level of very harsh laws. That actually what is acted out in such wars. And beneath this is something quite different. For instance, I can set up a family, 2 people, and I don't do anything, and suddenly they are driven by a force. And they face the real issue, and this force directs them towards a solution which goes beyond the laws which operate in the foreground. And if we can reach that soul, we reach the healing force. That would be a brief statement of but perhaps just one thing to the first constellation. The 2 daughters, they're very upset. And the one was full of hatred. And it was quite clear she becomes a murderer with this hatred. And the other one, this one went to her father, wanted to go to her father. And the other one was very upset in a different way. She wanted to become a victim. And I let them lie beside their parents. And then they were united with them, and then they could stand up. No longer with hatred, no longer with despair, and they could turn away from the dead, leave them alone, and look at life. That would also be a solution in there. I've talked too long. Now the others have their turn.
I was very interested by all of that, but especially by this question of the healing power and the greater soul. I would think of the soul as being very similar to the field. But the field is something which holds habits and maintains the stability of the system as it is. So as you rightly say, it wouldn't from itself have the power to heal. But I wonder, you see, every language has its own usage, but in English the word we would have for that would be spirit. The moving power is more the spirit. It has a much wider meaning in German. But that which moves, that which brings changes, and that which brings healing is traditionally the spirit, and the soul is more that which gives stability and form and structure. I wonder if you would see it in terms of the spirit working through the soul.
Yes, for me, soul, even if very, very wide and deep, is limited. And spirit goes beyond that. So what the realm of spirit remains for me a mystery, a profound mystery, and the realm of soul is observable. The laws operating there are observable. The laws which lead to destruction are observable, and the laws which lead to solutions are also observable. So I would refrain, for instance, to call this, what I call soul, something which could be, in a way, have a divine connotation or a religious connotation. The religious, what is religious, goes for me beyond that. That would be the realm of the spirit. So I would distinguish between those 2 fields.
Well, I would agree also that the soul is limited and the spirit less limited or not limited. But somehow the spirit must work through or in the soul. must somehow touch the soul if the power of the spirit is to work in and through the soul. So that I was simply saying that I agree it's a mystery, but how would you see the spirit working through the soul, or do you see it as something completely separate and nothing to do with the soul?
No, I wouldn't do that. The explanation you gave just now sounds all right for me, because the soul itself cannot work independent of something which is behind it again. So I would agree with that.
I would like to ask you a question, Madame Schützenberger. You were just reporting the way you see the background of the Kosovo conflict in a kind of anniversary syndrome, and you said this conflict cannot be resolved without regarding this and looking at this dynamics. So, but these facts are quite known.
They are known but forgotten.
Yes, so my question would be, how could you have a vision of, how to apply this knowledge not resolving this huge conflict? There's a kind of a gap, for me. There's these things happening with an enormous blind power, and there's this knowledge of this anniversary background. So do you have any vision how to get this, to get there into the real acting people?
I think there is something in the works of, excuse me, I'm not Hungarian, so I'm going to make a muddle of the name of Bozomenernagi. About cleaning the slate. And I feel that in the Kosovo there was a treason, and the Sultan was killed by treason. The Serb prince killed the Sultan by treason.
Miloš did it.
No, 600 years ago.
Yes, I know.
Yeah,
it was a certain Miloš.
Yeah. So the problem would be that probably you have to beg pardon in a symbolic way. And it could be done. Let's say that the King of Spain asked the Jews in Jerusalem to be pardoned of what they did during the Inquisition in Spain. And the mayor of Salem went to the cemetery and asked to be forgiven to the sorcerers that were burnt many years ago. So I think something should be done symbolically to beg pardon and to try to overcome the suffering and really recognize that our ancestors were wrong. Something like that. But sometimes it's very difficult. I would like to jump on the occasion to ask maybe Sheldrake, or maybe both of them, to help me to solve a riddle. I'll explain. Do we have the time?
Yes, we do.
Of something that happened with one of my clients that I don't know how it could be done. I'll explain. A lady came to work with the tragedy that her young cousin was killed by a lift in Paris. Usually when you take the lift, nothing happens. You take it every day. But this young man was killed by the lift. He opened the door to go outside, and there was no lift there. He looked there, and then the lift came and cut his head. So it was a very big tragedy. The young man was 18. It was very difficult to understand. So I tried to put it in the general context of the family and the history. And I said, is it related to royalty or something? And they said, what is the date? The date was January the 6th, and January the 6th for Christians is the King's, la fête des rois. So I said, was it related? It was that day. And the story is that, I don't know how it is in Germany, but in France we have a more distance like that?
No?
Is it better? Okay. In France, we usually have a special, une galette des rois, how do you say it in English? A cake for the kings on January the 6th, and you go to a baker and you bring the special galette, and then you have a crown, and then you have a special little stone or something in it, and then somebody is the king and somebody is the queen. And that day there was not the crown, so the young man went to the baker to pick up the crowns back, and he was killed. I asked them, is there a relationship to the French Revolution and the kings? And there was. The great-great-grandfather of this young man has been the first one to vote during the terror, the death for King Louis XVI. And after that, he felt a little bit guilty because you probably don't know French history, but the French Revolution, they killed the king by one vote of majority. So the first one to vote felt guilty because maybe he tipped the things. And his great-great-grandson was killed on the day of the kings by a lift. Now, this could happen. I have seen many cases like that. I wonder how the memory of things could come back in events that change outside life, and then people are punished for what their ancestors did. I was wondering if you have an answer to this question. How could it be?
Well, I don't have an answer, but I think there are several alternative hypotheses. One is a mysterious unconscious memory, which somehow remembers places, dates, and so on, and modes of death, and somehow constructs this. I find that very mysterious indeed. The other hypothesis one would think about would, when the king was beheaded, there must have been a lot of people who didn't agree with it, the fact there was only one vote. And there may have been a lot of people who wished ill on those who'd done it. So you see, is it in the family of the person, of the perpetrator, or is it some desire for revenge on the part of those who've suffered? So is it more like a totally unconscious memory, or is it more in the nature of a curse? And in some cases, curses are consciously made. So this would lead to quite different hypotheses as to how it might work. In a sense, the curse is a more active hypothesis. It involves less of a complete mystery, because you have the projection of an intention, a malevolent intention, which would perhaps, again working in mysterious ways, bring about a pattern of events later. But what do you think of the curse theory? I mean, do you consider that kind of theory?
I have seen it happen many times, especially in the French royal family. The curse working 100 years later or 200 years later. But in the case I brought up, it went through a lift not working, which is it was not man-managed that day. It was a symbolic day, but nobody pushed a button to kill that young man. It just happened.
No,
the curse does work very often.
You see, if one thinks of prayers, blessings, and curses as being similar, all of them, although they involve human intentions in the first place, seem to involve modes of action which don't just work through other people, but may work through the natural world. I mean, otherwise people wouldn't be praying on a daily basis, and certainly every Sunday, for a whole range of phenomena which go beyond the merely human realm. So we have to assume that, at least in traditional belief, these forms of intention can work not only through human agency. And I imagine that any form of intention working in the world must work through modification of chance events. I mean, the only way that we can imagine an intention, or for that matter a morphic field working in the world, is through imposing a pattern on what would otherwise be indeterminate events. And presumably somewhere in the mechanism of a lift, there are some things that depend on chance when they go wrong and so on, and these could be susceptible to influence. I mean, that's the best I can do in terms of a general model. I don't know, Bert may have a better one. Do you?
Well, many years I only worked on the assumption that the events can be confined to 4 generations. Only when I heard about your work, I was looking further, and it has expanded my view enormously. Albrecht was introducing that to me. He promoted that in our group, made your work open to us. Now, what I observed within those families, and it can be extended now, I'm quite sure, is that there is something like a conscience, a unconscious conscience, which operates according to certain laws. And I have defined those laws. And the first one is this unconscious soul or conscience wants to preserve the integrity of a group. And whenever one member is excluded or forgotten, then this kind of conscience or soul picks somebody from a later generation to represent the former person. And this person then acts out the life of the former one. This is one observation. The second law I observed in there was that this conscience wants to establish a balance between benefit and loss. And if somebody was guilty in a former generation, but he did not face his guilt, then somebody from a later generation will take up the atonement for that guilt. So, for instance, he will kill himself. We see that with the Nazi murderers, for instance, and many descendants, 2 or 3 generations later, have a tendency to be suicidal. And then they want to redress that. Now, recent observations I made in family constellations, and that may have a bearing also on Kosovo, is that when we allow the dead victims and the dead murderers to face each other, and in family constellations we can set up a setting where that is possible, then it doesn't need any intervention whatever from outside. There will be a movement where they come together, and all that was considered by the living as unjust or which requires atonement does not apply to the dead. They meet on a level where they are really one. And now what causes the disturbance is that the living take upon themselves something which only the dead among themselves can achieve. So the healing movement would be that the living look at the dead, let them do this movement, look at them once more, and then they turn away. And then they look to the future. And that would be the healing movement that goes on another level. So the interference in the realm of the dead causes for the living a disturbance.
I would like to ask you a question that has been bothering me a lot for many years. If you look at a family where there are, let's say, 15 cousins, one of them will take on himself the past history. I have always wondered, is it the family who choose that person, or the person who chooses to be a representative of the past? Do I have a hunch?
Neither nor. It is the family soul or the family conscience which picks that person. And there's no one guilty actually picking somebody. It's a force which requires that somebody does it, and the weakest one, as a rule, takes it upon himself.
The weakest or the strongest?
Or
The more weak or the stronger one of the family?
the weakest. As a child, often the youngest one takes it upon himself, the one who can resist the forces least. I don't want to make that a general. I have observed that often, but often it is the firstborn too. Quite often it is. But it's always one in a weaker position who does that. And to come back to the perpetrators and the victims, the murderers feel great very often and very strong when faced with, and then in their families, the weakest one takes upon the atonement. When they are faced with the victims become very, very great, and the murderers very, very small. And so there is a kind of balance achieved at that level. And then the living are no longer involved, if that can happen. And that is a kind of healing ritual. Albert was telling me, you also apply healing rituals to achieve that peace.
The healing rituals I apply are very wide, in a wide range. Sometimes it is a Christian ritual. I ask the people to make a mass, if they are Catholic, to go to church and make a special mass for the dead. Sometimes we make in a group a ritual like 1 minute of silence for the dead and their sufferings. Sometimes we made a ritual planting a tree or planting a tree on a road where this accident happened, or sending flowers in the sea, or burning a candle and telling the dead that they are free to go to the right side of God and be quiet. Kind of rituals of this kind. Or using psychodrama. I'm a psychodramatist. So we make a small vignette or a scene, and somebody who is, the person who is working will choose somebody to represent the dead, and then we'll make a role reversal. And then we ask the protagonist, ask the dead what he wants. And very often very strange things happen, because he would say, I want to be remembered, I want to have a tree planted on my sur ma tombe, how do you say that? On my grave, or I want things like that. Sometimes it's very moving, and I'm working a lot with the people who were close to the dead of the last 2 or 3 wars, and the first war and the second. And very often the dead would say, I want to be remembered. I want this never to happen again, or things like that. And then we make a small ritual. And then very often people who had asthma stops or things like that. It's quite interesting to see it happens. We call it, I would like to quote a research. I'm a university person, so excuse me, I'm always quote scientific research. There was a research done in Berlin in the Institute of Psychology under Kotlevin by a lady called Bluma Zeigarnik on finished and unfinished tasks. And she proved that if a task is not finished, if the gestalt is not finished, could you hold that for me? If there is a gestalt which is not closed, one needs to close the gestalt. And it's the same with memory and unfinished business. So we have to finish the business of the suffering or the event. Would it be 50 years ago, 200 years ago, or 1,000 years ago? It has to be closed. And before it is done, generation after generation, they suffer from the problem. If I may quote the Bible, could you excuse me? There is a sentence, my English is not very good. Some people ate grapes that were unripe, and then their descendants had the teeth aching for 4 or 10 generations. It seems that it has been happening all the time. So we have to close the gestalt and finish the trauma.
Last time we met, we talked about places where many accidents happened. And you told me in England there are such places. They're usually close to old battlefields.
Oh.
Well, we have...
Tell me more about it.
Well, there's a phrase in English called accident black spot. Do you have a similar phrase in French? Well, they have...
What is an accident black spot?
A place where many accidents happen on a road. And sometimes they have big signs up saying, accident black spot, beware. And some of these, there's an accident black spot near my home. And even as a young child, I was fascinated by these signs by the roads, accident black spot. It's a place where the road is a bit hilly, so you could think of a natural explanation, people overtaking and a lorry comes up from the hill. So it's not as if it's a perfectly flat, straight piece of road. So there are some topological features. But also, this is just on the edge of a battlefield, the Battle of Stoke, which took place in 1487. And was a major battle, it was in a civil war in England. Many people were killed there. Irish troops were killed there in large numbers. And right next to this battleground is this accident black spot. Well, there's one in Ireland. We were traveling in Ireland, and right next to the battleground of the Battle of the Boyne, there's a sign up saying accident black spot. And I've come across several examples of this kind. So I think that memories in places, you see, may be important too. If we take a morphic field view, morphic fields are not confined to human groups or human minds. They're not even confined to animal groups and so on, but places could have them too. And all around the world we find traditions of memories in places, and after all, pilgrimages are all based on going to places with powerful memories of what's happened before. And there are stories of hauntings and bad influences around battlefields too. So I think that any memory hypothesis has to take into account the memory of place. And at the moment, the data are largely anecdotal, but I dare say that one could systematically find accident black spots in different countries and look at the historical background. And of course, there's a positive feedback. Once there's an accident has happened there, then it may make it more likely for others to happen as well. So even without the battlefield, there would be a tendency for accident black spots to get more important.
It's fascinating. I have found the same with dates. Do you want an example?
Well, I'm already shuddering from the fact that June the 28th is my birthday. So let's hear another example. I've only got one birthday, so
Take another June if you don't mind. I have to take example from the French history because I'm French, excuse me. During the war, General de Gaulle made an appeal on June 18, l'appel du 18 juin, to go on fighting. Now, what is June 18? If you look at the history, this is Waterloo, June 18, where the British defeated the French. Some 60 years later, there was another battle at Sebastopol where the British and the French went against the Russian. There was a British general and a French general, and they didn't know who would decide to be the main general for the day. I don't know if they took aces or cards or a straw or whatever, but they decided it would be the French. Then, of course, if I may say so, they were defeated before Sebastopol, because June 28, the French are defeated. That's the split of the tongue. Yeah, it has nothing to do with your birthday. So it's very strange how things got repeated. If you take the date of the Crusades, St. John of Acre was taken on one day by the Christians, and 100 years later, on the same day, they were taken back by the Muslims. It seems that dates are very important. You are speaking of events on places, I agree, but on dates it's happened the same, as if there were dates on time.
With dates, I agree. This is a most interesting thing, and I read your article on dates with great interest. Dates, though, because they bear so little relation to the natural rhythms, must be something whose significance is largely preserved in human minds, consciously to start with. And in some of the cases where you gave of accidents happening to people in later generations coinciding with the dates when people had been killed in great battles like Verdun, it seems to me that the memory, since it's a natural human tendency to observe anniversaries, people go to cemeteries and put flowers on the graves of ancestors on the date of their death or on the date of their birth. Many families have their own private rituals to do with these anniversaries. I should think most families do. They remember these significant dates. At least in the first generation when the event has happened, this would have been repeated many times on that date and remembered consciously. So it seems to me there's a means there where the date can actually be firmly fixed in the conscious memory of a group, and it may then be preserved in an unconscious memory. But it seems to me the significance of dates has to be through the natural human tendency to observe anniversaries and to reenact them or to have little rituals on those anniversaries. Would you not agree with that?
Yeah, but sometimes it's completely forgotten. I have seen, let's come to happy incidents instead of unhappy ones. I have seen sometimes people getting married 300 or 400 years later on the same day without knowing it until they did the research.
Well, it did seem to me that a simple statistical analysis of dates of marriages, deaths, and perhaps births in the light of your studies would be quite easy to do, looking at marriage records, to see whether there's a statistical tendency for people within families to get married on similar dates. I mean, this is something that could be looked at on a massive scale using computers and readily available statistics. So one could actually study that tendency. Whether it's conscious or unconscious would be, in each case, would have to be decided separately, but there's a huge body of data that could be studied statistically.
For me, the question would be how to redeem the places and the dates, how to undo the curse on the places and on the dates. I think that is the important question. And when we talked about it last time, when we talked about perhaps having a memorial stone there, and perhaps something similar with regard to dates. But I have now a very peculiar idea about it.
Which one?
It arises from recent experiences I had in family constellations. I think if there is a memorial stone at a battlefield, it must be in honor of all the dead there. That's very important. If only one party does that, you see, then it's of no use. And I could, for instance, imagine if the Battle of Waterloo, all the dead there would be remembered and honored, then the curse of that date may be diminished.
In the case of the Battle of East Stoke, the one next to the accident black spot near my home in Nottinghamshire, I suggested to the vicar of East Stoke that he held a requiem on the anniversary of the battle. And there was a local society who reenacted the battle. In England we have these amateur battle reenacting societies that dress up in ancient uniforms and reenact battles from English history, and they're particularly keen on doing them on anniversaries, important. So hundreds of these had converged to reenact the Battle of East Stoke. There was a lot in the newspapers about it. And to finish the day, I suggested to the vicar that he did a service, a requiem for all those who died in the battle on both sides, and all those who died at the accident black spot. And he agreed. Without any hesitation, he said he thought this was a really good idea, and he did it. I haven't looked at the accident statistics since, but it would be a good idea to do so, I think.
I wonder if it would be the appropriate time now to take a few questions from the audience and then to let our day be complete.
You three discussed over the Kosovo conflict. And Mrs. Sorry, I've forgotten your name. Schützenberger? Okay. You spoke about a kind of symbolic ritual which could be taken, a kind of forgiving ritual which has the source or the power to diminish the cruel energy out of the Kosovo conflict, if I understood you right. And you, Bert, in your speech of this evening told us that you were completely against setting up the Kosovo conflict by a kind of a Familienaufstellung or so. I see a contradiction in this, and my question is, if there would be any possibility to by a setup of the Kosovo conflict to make a kind of a ritual, a symbolic ritual, forgiving ritual, perhaps with the people in the room or however it could be done, which could diminish the negative energy which is in the Kosovo conflict in a way Mrs. Schützenberger told us.
Well, to think that we, by a family constellation, can first find out what the roots of the conflicts are, and to see a solution that seems to me far beyond our capacity. So that's why I'm against it. But inspired by what you said about the Kosovo conflict, I could imagine if that Prince Lazar and the Sultan who was killed were buried in the same memorial, that would be a healing ritual.
Other questions?
I was fascinated by the dates of history and what Madame Schützenberger said. And I was thinking of a German date in history, November the 9th, which was the Reichskristallnacht. It was something else I've forgotten, and it was the opening of the wall. And I was wondering, two events were bad and one was good. What has happened in Germany? If you have any ideas.
I'm sorry, I don't know enough history of Germany. I have no ideas, but maybe Mr. Hellinger has.
Well, could I just, so this, one of the dates I'm keenest on is actually November the 10th. So I have an interest in all these things, November the 9th, 10th. There's a complex of dates there. November the 10th, St. Martin's Eve, is a very important date in the history of science, because this was the date on which René Descartes in Germany had his vision of the world as a great machine. His vision, Descartes, he was in winter quarters at Neuburg am Donau on November the 10th, 1619, when he had a vision of the whole world as a machine. It was the first vision of a world of just matter in motion. And it was the beginnings, really, of the mechanistic worldview, the foundations of the scientific revolution. Descartes thought it was revealed to him by the angel of truth. And he also believed the Black Madonna had inspired it. He went on a pilgrimage to Loreto in Italy to give thanks for this vision. But it was a vision of great importance for him, a very numinous event, followed by 3 very disturbing dreams. Anyway, I've always been very interested in the significance of November the 10th and the many things that have happened in Germany around those dates. And, of course, the armistice on November the 11th, which is celebrated in England with the silence for remembering the dead in the war, the First World War. This series of dates, November 9th, 10th, 11th, which are to do really with the Roman martial festival, and St. Martin, the red, with his red cloak, is a Christianized version of the Mars principle. It's a ancient military complex of festivals, and Descartes was a soldier at the time of his vision. Exactly a year later, he entered Prague in the Battle of the White Mountain, representing the counter-Reformation, to put down the regime of the Winter King and Queen. And this began the 30 Years' War in Europe. So, I mean, this was a very, very interesting complex of dates. I was so fascinated by it, in fact, that a few years ago with several friends from Munich, we actually went to Neuburg on November the 10th. And we did some little ceremonies and prayed there to go beyond the Cartesian vision. But it was a very powerful place and time to do it. So anyway, I don't know, I have myself thought about those complex of dates, and I'm sure there's a lot more, particularly in Germany, to do with that time of the year. But it has a more general significance because of its martial significance. And it's part of the general Festival of the Dead, which starts with Halloween, October the 31st, then the Festival of All Saints and All Souls, and then the memory of the war dead. That whole complex is the beginning of the Celtic New Year, is to do with the memory of the dead, the crack in time when the dead become present again, which is why in Halloween ceremonies people dress as witches and skeletons and ghosts. That festival period lasts from October the 31st through till the middle of November.
I think we can conclude now this evening, which was successful, I think. Thank you for being here together. I think we have a good reason to look forward for your workshop and your workshop tomorrow and after tomorrow. Einen guten Abend, einen schönen Abend, gute Nacht.